today, and the Asia Program Director, Robert Hathaway. Today's topic could not, do we have, the computer went to sleep. Okay. That's not come up before, and I guess the 40th anniversary of Monty Python, they'd say, and now for something completely different. Plus our speaker is also has laryngitis, so she's going to. Pardon? Okay. But while we wait for a password to reawaken our PowerPoint presentation, let me introduce today's speaker, Christine Fair, who's on the faculty of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's a top expert on Pakistan and South Asia. Before joining the faculty at Georgetown, she served as a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation, and she was a senior research associate in USIP's, the United States Institute of Peace's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention. She's a prolific author. Her most recent books is titled Treading Softly on Sacred Ground, Counterinsurgency Operations on Sacred Space, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, as well as two publications from the U.S. Institute of Peace, The Madrasa Challenge and Fortifying Pakistan, the Role of U.S. Internal Security Assistance. Today, her topic is Pakistani public opinion towards terrorism. Could not be more timely with the Secretary of State visiting there and terrorism being in the centerpiece of their agenda. Christine's presentation today is drawn from a forthcoming article in the Journal of International Affairs published by Columbia University. So she'll provide us with an overview of and the article contains many graphs, so I take it that this is based on actual empirical research. So with that, Christine, welcome to the Wilson Center. Hope you can make it through today's presentation. We appreciate you doing it, with this difficulty, but we look forward to your remarks.
So I guess we'll have a chorus of coughing. It's a good thing you came in because it was also unplugged and it had like 2 minutes of battery left. All right, so I'm going to be talking about Pakistan's own war on terrorism. As is well known, Pakistan has been engaging in variously characterized war against its own extremism for a number of years now. And while the military and the government sustains considerable criticism about the efficacy and the dedication to that struggle, one of the areas that I think is important to the government's ability to continue fighting this fight has actually sustained not as much criticism, and that is the ownership that Pakistanis have had in embracing their own war on terrorism. I'm really sorry. I'm trying to get through this. So there's actually quite a number of organizations that do public opinion polling in Pakistan. I've been involved in about 4 different surveys of Pakistani opinion in a variety of institutional arrangements. And the first thing I want to tell you is it's actually not easy. So in April, I went to Pakistan with a colleague, Jacob Shapiro, working with Neil Malhotra, and we were trying to test drive some new methods of doing public opinion work in Pakistan through a device called information queuing. So you're not actually asking people, what do you think about al-Qaeda, but you're actually running an experiment where you're inserting information about al-Qaeda into the question. We'll talk about that later. But in the course of doing that survey, we began training several of our enumerator teams that would go out and that would actually collect the data on our behalf. And in the training sessions of those enumerators, we had a number of insights that I thought would share with you, even though I'm not going to present the results of that data collection exercise. We met with 7 teams. We met with teams from rural Sindh and urban Sindh, northern Punjab, southern Punjab, Baluchistan, as well as the frontier province. And I imagine if you sitting around this room, if I were to go around and ask each and every single one of you, do you think Pakistanis know what al-Qaeda is? I would imagine most of you would say yes. because we all know what Al-Qaeda is. Therefore, everyone else must know what Al-Qaeda is. Well, I can tell you from my own experience in Pakistan over the last many, many, many years, many Pakistanis don't know what Al-Qaeda is. And sure enough, we went with our enumerators. We went through the survey that we had developed and had back translated a number of times. We went around the room with each of the enumerators and we asked them, can you explain to us what Al-Qaeda is? Very few people knew what Al-Qaeda was. Now, if you tell them that Osama bin Laden's organization, they're much more likely to register that. But here was an even more shocking story, and I'm just going to preface this so that you will have some skepticism when you read poll data after this story. So we were working with the team in Baluchistan, and I think most of us know the Quetta Shura is called the Quetta Shura because it is the Taliban Shura based in Quetta. So we were working with the enumerators from Quetta, and we asked them, what is the Taliban? And very curiously, one woman raised her hand. Now, this was extraordinary because, generally speaking, few people knew what the Taliban were or what Al Qaeda is, and women, as a subset, were even less likely. Yet this woman raised her hand and she said, "Taliban, wo Hamid Karzai ki tanzim." It's Hamid Karzai's organization. So I raise this just to give you some understanding that we use this vernacular, Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and we look at polling data about these terms, and we simply assume that there is a fairly consistent understanding across both sides of the table what they mean. And after my experience of dealing with these 7 teams of enumerators for our survey in April, I'm actually very skeptical. And I will add that the teams that we worked with were probably some of the best educated people you're going to encounter. On average, everyone had their FA, almost all of them had their BA, and many had their MA. And on average, they had 5 or more years of experience. So if this is the vernacular understanding of important words like Taliban, Al-Qaeda among these very educated people, one could only imagine what that level of understanding would be among the illiterate rural populations where most of Pakistan's population resides. Now, before going into presenting the empirical data, I also want to give you some sense of the militant landscape in Pakistan. And so when we're talking about Pakistan's own war on terror, what groups are we talking about? Which groups are we not talking about? So as many of you know, Pakistan has been home to a number of militant groups based in and operating from Pakistan for a number of decades. On the one hand, you have these so-called Kashmiri groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Harkat-ul-Jihad-e-Islami. It's really a misnomer. Very few of them are actually Kashmiri, and they really don't operate exclusively in Kashmir. Nonetheless, these groups have largely operated under the banner of liberating Kashmir. You've also had, for many decades, a number of sectarian groups. And when we're talking about sectarian, we're really talking about Deobandi Sunni militant groups targeting Shia. In the past, there used to be Shia militias that targeted Sunni, but for the most part, those groups have really died down. In addition, you have, since 2004, the rise of the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban. And what's interesting about the TTP is that unlike the so-called Kashmiri groups, which were really instrumentalized by the state to prosecute Pakistan's interests outside of the state, the TTP, cannibalizing some of the militant manpower from these other organizations, now targets the state. And so this is for the first time in Pakistan's history where it's had to really countenance the effects of blowback of its own policies. So when we're talking about Pakistan's ownership of its own war on terrorism, we're talking about Pakistan's war against the Pakistan Taliban. This is also distinct from the Afghan Taliban. We should make no mistake. Just because Pakistan has lost 1,800 or so, there's no independent corroboration of those fatality figures fighting its own war on terrorism. This does not mean that Pakistan has taken action against Mullah Omar, Hekmatyar, Haqqani. So we should be very clear that just because they're fighting the Pakistan Taliban, it does not mean that this is degrading the sanctuary that the Afghan Taliban enjoys. And to give you a sense of how granular and how granular our conflict is with Pakistan, let me give you the example of a fellow named Maulvi Nazir. Maulvi Nazir is a South Waziristan-based militant. He raises suicide bombers to target U.S., NATO, and Afghan forces in Afghanistan. you would think, hopefully, that he would be an object of the Pakistani offensive in South Waziristan. But unfortunately for us, but fortunately for Pakistan, Mr. Nazir is actually an ally because he has actually been a foe of other elements of the TTP. So this is a really interesting example of how our enemy list and Pakistan's enemy list really don't overlap very nicely. And I'm relatively confident that Mr. Nazir is not going to be affected by the sanguinary operations taking place in South Waziristan. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm not talking about the Afghan Taliban. I want you to just put those guys out of your mind. What we're really talking about is Pakistani ownership of its own war against Pakistan militants targeting the state. This is not Pakistan targeting Lashkar-e-Taiba. That's another organization that you've heard about. Lashkar-e-Taiba operates from Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in India, but it is not the object of state activities. We're really looking at Pakistani ownership of its war on terrorism against the Pakistani Taliban. Now, it turns out that there are a number of data sources about Pakistani attitudes towards militancy. However, the caveat is only after 9/11. This really wasn't interesting to people for, I guess, obvious reasons before 9/11, so we really don't have any way of anchoring these results prior to 9/11. But one of the earliest organizations that have been collecting data on Pakistan is actually the Pew Foundation. Let me give you a little bit of background about the Pew data set. I've worked with it. It's free. That's why people use it. You can get respondent level data. You don't have to pay for it. The downside of Pew is that it's largely an urban sample. It's a very small sample, so you can't do much with it. Pew collects data on about 14 countries, many of which are not terribly strategically interesting. So given that most of Pakistan's population resides in a rural population, what we make of a thoroughly urban sample, I don't know. For reasons that we can discuss in the Q&A, it's actually very difficult to get an urban sample, which is why Pew and everyone else tends to go for these urban samples. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is that in 2004, Pakistan, along with Lebanon, actually had the highest level of support for this question. We basically were asking support for suicide bombing and other attacks on civilians. In 2004, the number of persons that said it was often justified was 30-some%. And another 10% or so said it was sometimes justified. So in 2004, this was actually one of the highest levels of support that existed across the 14 countries that Pew surveyed. It was only higher in Lebanon. Something very interesting happened. You'll see the on the left-hand side is the percentage of individuals indicating often all the way down to never justified. And the right hand is actually the number of suicide bombings that have taken place per year. So what you actually see happening is that Pakistani's appetite for suicide bombing really begins to diminish when suicide bombing starts happening in Pakistan. So I like to put the slide up because sometimes people, I think, misuse these data. They assume that if support for terrorism is high in a particular country, that maybe the supply of terrorism is also high. So I put this up here to remind you that we can't confuse supply, i.e. the numbers of people that engage in terrorism, we can't confuse it with demand, the number of people that support it. Because in fact, as terrorism goes up, demand for it may go down. So I put this up here only to caution you about how we read these data and how much we can do with these data without a formal econometric model. So the next several slides look at the degree to which Pakistanis understand their own internal security situation. These data that I presented here have actually been collected by IRI. IRI has done a fabulous job collecting data. They do not rely upon an urban sample. They have a nationally representative sample. In fact, for the survey the two surveys I was recently involved in the spring, we used the same firm. Very good firm. They use a sample of like 3,000 people. The problem with the IRI data is that you can't get respondent level data. So the best we can do is get these point estimates, which is very unfortunate because their data are actually quite good. IRI, since circa 2006, 2007, the exact questions that they ask in each of the different waves vary. But we have a fairly good baseline going back to somewhat early 2007 about Pakistanis' views about religious extremism. Is it a serious problem in Pakistan or is it not? And what's clear in this slide is that a fluctuating and increasing majority in fact see religious extremism in Pakistan as a severe problem, as a serious problem. when asked explicitly about the Taliban and al-Qaeda, you see a very similar issue. From June '08 onward, many more people agree that both Pakistan, or that the Taliban and al-Qaeda is a serious threat in Pakistan. And it's really quite dramatic, the numbers of people that agree that it is a serious threat. Let me also show you the next slide. This comes from a survey that I was a part of in May of 2009. Now, this survey was fielded right after the strategic overreach of the TTP when they went into Bunair. So in a few minutes, I'll be presenting some data that IRI did before the Bunair overreach, as well as our data. But I just want to let you know that our data was fielded after the Taliban seized Bunair, after the peace deal that was much discussed in March, April, failed, and the military was forced to resume operations. What's interesting about this slide, and I'm going to present more interprovincial differences, is just how different views are in the provinces. Now, this is actually one of the slides where there's most coherence of opinion. So the survey that we did, we conducted them in the 4 main provinces of Pakistan. We did not do them in Fatah. We did not do them in the northern areas or Azad Kashmir that are not formally part of the Pakistan census. So we only focused our attention on NWP, Punjab, Balochistan, and Sindh. So when we disaggregated the response about threat perception by province, it's very clear that Balochistan, interestingly enough, is more ambivalent about the threat perception than our residents in NWP, Punjab, and Sindh. And this is interesting, of course, because that is exactly where the Afghan Taliban reside, is in Balochistan. So what we've seen in the last several slides is that it's absolutely unequivocal that Pakistanis understand and increasingly with alarm, appreciate the threat that these groups pose to its own security. But this should not be confused with their support for the U.S.-led war on terrorism. Far from it. And this is a point that I like to bring home. I hear a lot of discussions about how do we get the Pakistanis to embrace the U.S. war on terror? How do we get the Pakistanis to do our bidding? From my point of view, I'm just happy that they're going to do their own bidding. Because it's not necessarily the case that just because they increasingly appreciate the danger that these groups pose to their country, that they're going to sign on to what we're doing. In fact, as this slide demonstrates, quite the opposite, in fact. So the next several slides look at Pakistani attitudes towards how their own country is handling their own problem. Now, this slide, to me, in conjunction with the couple of slides that come after, it's kind of interesting. So this slide, again, draws from IRI data. IRI asked respondents whether or not they support the Pakistan Army fighting extremists in NWFP and Fatah. Now, a number of years ago, I asked a similar question when I worked at USIP when we asked about the U.S. Army engaging in operations in Pakistani territory, and it was actually quite similar. They didn't want any military operating, but conditional on some military operating, it's better to be Pakistani. But what's clear from this slide is that even though many Pakistanis are increasingly of the belief that these groups pose a threat, they're still very ambivalent about army action. And in fact, they're even, the ambivalence, they're becoming more ambivalent in the sense that the gap between those that agree and disagree with the army actions is actually narrowing. Now, this is actually, in some sense, a positive sign because it means that the opposition to the military action is declining. So this is good news in the sense that people are becoming more ambivalent because resistance to military action is declining. But this is not to say that folks are with great enthusiasm embracing the military action. The next two slides, these are sort of static questions. IRI only asked them in these 2 years about supporting the army fighting al-Qaeda as well as the Taliban, and they're actually quite similar. Again, you see the same sort of ambivalence that we saw in the previous slide. This, however, is my favorite slide. So if the first slide I showed you demonstrated that Pakistanis are becoming more ambivalent as opposed to opposed to military action, this slide looks at public support for the peace deals with militants. Now let's talk a little bit about these peace deals. I'm sure many of you know that there have been maybe 5, 6, 7 peace deals, depending on what you count as a peace deal with militants, the first of which was the Shakai Agreement in 2004 with Sheikh Mohammed. What's clear about all of these peace deals is that they were all basically ratifications of defeat on the ground with the militants. The government compensated the militants for their losses. The government allowed the militants to keep their weapons, with the exception of heavy weaponry. The government almost always went to the place where the militants were, which was interpreted consistently as the government offering its defeat, not vice versa. And we saw this in the various press releases that Sheikh Mohammed, for example, issued. So all of the peace deals were very favorable to the militants and really bestowed them with financial resources and political legitimacy that they really didn't otherwise earn. What's also clear about the peace deals is that in every single case, they failed to bring peace. But what is absolutely curious is that for the most part, from November 07 onwards, peace deals generally sustained quite a bit of support among Pakistanis. And then something very strange happened, and that was in May, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. One way in which I interpret this is that in the number of years I've spent in Pakistan, and this was certainly true before the Bunair overreach, was there was this almost implicit assumption that if these people out in the Pashtun belt want to have these deals, if they want to live like this, if they want to put up with these Taliban, so be it. We just don't want to have suicide attacks in Lahore, Karachi, Rawalpindi. So there was this implicit understanding that whatever craziness was happening, as long as it happened to the west of the Indus, which is sort of this traditional psychosocial demarcation line in Pakistan where all the jungleness can happen west of the Indus, just not east of the Indus, that's okay. My friend Thomas Barfield has a wonderful analogy for this. You know, we think of sovereignty, American sovereignty it's American cheese. You take a bite here, you take a bite there. It's all American cheese. But for Pakistanis, sovereignty can be like Swiss cheese. As long as the holes are west of the Indus, that's absolutely fine. And I think there's more truth to that than not, as a matter of fact. But what happened in Bunair, if you look at Bunair on a map, Bunair starts to...
Can you just explain
that
there's a shorthand?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Overreach. Could you just explain what happened?
Yeah, we'll do. And there's actually, we have data on this. I just don't have it here with me. So, for the longest time, this was seen as a Pashtun insurgency. Pashtuns in Pakistan, they're concentrated in the northwest frontier province, the federally administered tribal areas, which is a completely different constitutional arrangement for territories abutting Afghanistan. So for many people, there was this, and of course there are also Pashtuns in pockets of Baluchistan. So for many people, there was this belief that this was a Pashtun insurgency and that the Pakistani Taliban would remain confined to traditional Pashtun strongholds. And I don't even know how one describes it. Psychosocially, the Indus River for many people has historically been the dividing line between the civilized Pakistan of the Punjab and the uncivilized world of the Pashtun. So for many folks, as long as the Pashtun insurgency remained a Pashtun insurgency and didn't threaten to call into question the way of life of people outside of the civilized world, i.e. east of the Indus, everything could be largely managed. And that's my interpretation of why people were basically willing to toss the bone of Sharia to the folks in this part of Pakistan if it could buy peace on that part of Pakistan. But if you look at Bunair on a map, Bunair is actually cutting really close. It's abutting to that psychological border of the Indus. And I was actually in Pakistan in April, just as all of this was coming to a boil. And people really began questioning, maybe the Taliban are not going to stop at the Pashtun territories. And in fact, we asked this question in the PIPA survey that I was a part of. Do you think the Taliban are going to stop with the Pashtun territory? And it was actually interesting, the provincial variation. If you're interested, I can send you a website. It's what the provinces think. It's the provincial breakdown of these data. People who lived in the NWP in the Punjab were absolutely convinced that these guys were not going to stop at the Indus. people in Balochistan and Sindh, they were a little bit more ambivalent. So that's what I mean. So this idea that the Pakistan Taliban would be confined to their own territory, the fact that they overran Bunair sent an important signal to Pakistanis that actually they're not going to stop here, that they actually have larger objectives. They simply do not want to claim Pashtun lands as their areas of operation. So if you take a look here at March 09, let me just draw your attention. You guys can, I don't have, does this have like a pointer? Yeah, it does. So this is March 2009. In March of 2009, there had already been a lot of discussion. The militants had taken SWAT. The militants were basically saying that if you let us establish Sharia in SWAT, we'll enter into a peace deal and everything is going to be copacetic. And there was a lot of debate about this peace deal. So in March of 09, over 70% supported peace deals generally with the extremists. Another question that IRI asked was whether or not they in particular supported peace deals with the militants in Malakan and SWAT. Over 80% said they did. And a similarly high number of persons thought that that would actually bring peace. And again, this is absolutely astonishing because all of the previous deals failed to bring peace. So what sustained this optimism kind of goes back to the previous discussion about my working hypothesis. So in May of 2009, with PIPA, I was a part of a survey that asked a similar question. And we found that in May of 2009, Pakistani public opinion had genuinely changed, that they had really flipped, that they were not supporting these peace deals, that something had definitely broken in the Pakistani willingness to countenance peace deals as a way forward. And when IRI went back to the field in July 2009, you see that this has actually been sustained. So looking at the arc of this, the arc of public attitudes towards the Pakistani way of dealing with it, this is where we come to. We've moved from position of stark opposition to military action to ambivalence. And we've moved from a position of stark support for peace deals towards ambivalence. This is progress, but this is by no means a complete ownership of their own war on terrorism. Let me give you a little bit more to give you a flavor of the variation by province. I think this is very important. Most of the public opinion polling that you see on Pakistan presents a single point estimate, as if somehow there's one Pakistani opinion. Well, of course, there are many opinions. Even with the sample size that we have here, we can't go into much more detailed breakout. The best we can do here is at a provincial breakout. When we broke out by province, respondent answers to how much confidence you have in the way in which the military is handling the Pakistani Taliban, you see enormous variation. NWFP, which is where the brunt of the military action is taking place or adjacent to the locations where the military operations are taking place, the largest have some confidence. When you get to the Punjab, you have a majority actually having a lot of confidence. But take a look at what's going on in Balochistan and Sindh. And again, I think this reflects the experiences that the residents have in these different provinces and the differential exposure that they've had to violence. Oddly enough, while Balochistan is home to the Afghan Taliban really don't operate. They don't conduct operations in Balochistan against the residents. Sindh, while it had certainly been victim of sanguinary sectarian attacks some years ago, as well as inter-ethnic strife, with the exception of the Benazir Bhutto assassination attempt, Sindh's been relatively free of the TTP-related violence. So this, I think, really demonstrates how where you live affects how you view the situation. Here we've broken out by province. How do you think do you think the government did the right thing or made a mistake in forging the peace deal in SWAT? And again, it's just fascinating how the folks in these different provinces see it. NWFP, absolute ambivalence. Slight majority thought they did the right thing, but a very large minority, in fact, it's nearly neck and neck, thought it was a mistake. Absolute ambivalence in NWFP. In the Punjab, the majority thought they made a mistake. In Balochistan, they think they did the right thing, as in Sindh. So again, there is no Pakistani public opinion. It really depends on where you live and what your experience has been with these groups, as well as what the government's doing. So I'll close with just a few thoughts. So often in D.C., we hear a lot about strategic communications, that the U.S. needs to do a better job of communicating to Pakistanis to get Pakistan to embrace our goals, etc. What I actually take from this is somewhat of a different message. Probably the best thing that we could do working with our Pakistani friends is to help them craft a better strategic communications campaign. It's clear that public opinion matters. When I was in Pakistan in 2007 and later in 2008, the military had really come under considerable criticism for the military operations that it was conducting in Fatah. Pakistanis didn't like it. I heard people call Army officers razakars, which means collaborators. Army officers complained that they were being subjected to abuse, and in fact, Musharraf in 2007 even issued an order that officers should not wear their uniforms out in public, both to discourage them from being abused, which has an effect upon morale, but also obviously their security implications. So clearly, when the Army is embedded in a society which does not support what it's doing, I think you can make a very clear argument that it degrades our capabilities to act. So I think it's absolutely important that this window of opportunity, if you agree with me that is in fact a window, the Pakistanis are embracing a more proactive response to the TTP. The civilian government and the Army continue to consolidate this gain. And one of the positive things that you've seen, oddly enough, despite the problems with the civilian government, is that there has been cooperation between the civilians and the military in generating and sustaining public support for these operations. But it seems to me absolutely vital that Pakistan needs to have a better way of managing its own internal, having its own internal strategic communications campaign to sustain public support. Now, what this does not address, of course, are the Lashkar-e-Tayyibas and the Afghan Taliban and the other groups that are still running around Pakistan that are very much beyond the... how do we put this? There's just no way in the world that Pakistan is going to go after those groups. But going back to these data and the several polls that I've done in the last several years, there was one poll that we did a few years back when I was with USIP that was actually quite telling. We asked respondents whether or not they supported or how they viewed very specific attacks. So, for example, the Parliament attack in New Delhi from 2001, the Kaluchak massacre by LET in May of 2002. And we asked them whether they thought these attacks were justified. We also asked them whether they thought attacks against police, military, women and children, and so forth were justified. We also asked them whether or not they thought attacks against innocent civilians was justified. And not surprisingly, when people believed that innocent civilians were being attacked, they didn't support the attack. When they thought that police and military intelligence officials were being largely targeted, they tended to support that. So thinking about this public diplomacy campaign and how one can take better use of the information terrain, it strikes me that when Pakistanis have more information about what these groups are doing, they actually have better opinions. For some of you sitting in the room, I can tell you 3 years ago, Pakistanis didn't know who Baytullah Masood was. It was only when Baytullah Masood became a brand name in Pakistan, largely a negative brand name, that people embraced that he existed, that he was a bad guy, and embraced that something had to be done to take him out. So when I think about these, how one can maximize the use of these polling data, it seems that anything we can do to bring more transparency into the information terrain about how, or information about how information that can provide Pakistanis with greater clarity about the myriad groups operating in and from their country is probably a good idea. I have no voice, so I'm going to shut up.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's open it up now for comments and questions. Let me lead off with one question that follows on from your presentation. You took us through briefly the history and how some of these groups with a Kashmiri focus pointed at India were seen as having utility to the government. We won't call it necessarily state sponsorship of terrorism, but
we can.
But okay, or turning a blind eye, as Dan Byman put it in his recent book, etc. However you want to characterize it. And now they see that, and there was a permissive attitude about that. And now the context changes. They've been targeted themselves, and they're trying to focus on the group that your presentation focused on, the Pakistani Taliban. Does that shift in attitude extend to the kind of the traditional groups they'd backed that had kind of an India focus, where they see that they need to take a consistent line, that they can't be permissive in one context and try to crack down in another? Or do they still maintain this differentiation and the sense that in some contexts this can have utility?
Well, there are probably people in this room who can better answer that, who are in a better position to answer that than I can. My sense has been, over the last several years, is that there are folks...
Speak right in the microphone.
Sorry. There are changes in the security elite who kind of understand that this is not a strategy that Pakistan can sustain, that they cannot continue to say these are good jihadis, these are bad jihadis. That being said, I think there are also a number of people who have just the opposite conclusion, that what else can Pakistan do? That you have a rising India, you have an India whose presence is expanding in the region, and Pakistan's option set compresses, not expands, in terms of securing its equities. So I think it's absolutely the case that there are a number of people, and many of us know who they are because we meet them when we're in Pakistan, who say we can't sustain this. But I don't know if they are the voice that prevails. The other thing, from the point of view of just sort of popular opinion, most Pakistanis, because we've asked this, we have polling data, most Pakistanis don't actually believe that their government has had a policy of supporting militant groups through the ISI. And in fact, when you ask Pakistani, when you look at the polling data about who did the Marriott attack, for example, the most likely response is that India did it, as opposed to a domestic Pakistani terrorist. So the question is, who has these views? I think is important. I think there's a general perception in Pakistan that their government hasn't been doing this. And I think that's an important point. When you talk to Pakistanis in a variety of conferences, they seem to skip over this entire decade of the 1990s. They'll say that the Taliban is actually an American creation. So they go from 1989 to 2001. And of course, there's a complete decade of irresponsibility there, where your average Pakistani doesn't know that Pakistan was in fact cultivating these groups in Afghanistan, and then later the Taliban. So I think being able to break through this layer of ossified fiction is a huge public diplomacy task. I don't know if it's even possible.
Ossified fiction, that's a great phrase. Okay, let's open it up to comments and questions. Please wait for the microphone to come around and identify yourself. We'll start in the back, yes.
Thanks. I'm Carrie Anderson with Oxford Analytica. It's interesting to hear you say with Pakistan you see support for suicide bombings decrease as you see more suicide bombings happening. I think we've seen that in some Arab states as well. But as you were just saying, it seems a lot of the time people think that these attacks are actually caused. Sometimes you hear them blaming the United States or blaming India. So how do we work on that? If they don't think that it's the militants who are doing it, then it's going to be a public opinion problem.
No, that's what I said. I mean, ultimately, I think the only way forward in terms of Pakistanis owning a more comprehensive war on terrorism is to interject more information into their information space about what these groups do. Now, it is interesting. Our team, for example, from southern Punjab, this is a really good example of cognitive dissonance. Everyone knows about the southern Punjab situation. Southern Punjab is emerging as a militant recruitment hotspot. Of course, it's always been a sectarian militant hotspot. And these groups do have a grassroots presence. There are journalists in Pakistan covering this. They have photographs of militant training areas that have been purchased and acquired. And people know other families that have had children go off and become shaheed in the jihad. So this is absolutely at the grassroots level. Yet when we were talking to our enumerators, we had originally asked a question about Pakistani groups fighting in Kashmir. And the enumerators absolutely had a fit because we called them Pakistani groups fighting in Kashmir. They said, no, they're Kashmiri groups. I said, but wait a minute, you just told us that you knew people in your locality that went to fight in Kashmir. Aren't those people in your locality Pakistani? Yes, but they're Kashmiri. So there's this enormous cognitive disconnect, even though people will know, because they'll be in a locality where a well has been built to commemorate some shaheed. There is this enormous cognitive disconnect about who's doing what and from where. And I think it'll be very difficult to get Pakistan writ large as a society to reject all forms of militancy when it is largely deprived of vast amounts of information about the expanse of militant groups that operate in and from Pakistan.
Gentleman here.
Marvin Weinbaum, Middle East Institute. Chris, given this disconnect that you very rightly describe, an awakening which occurs after April into May, in which a recognition here that this is indeed a threat to the state, and at the same time, a persistence in the view that the U.S. is responsible for all of this and may even, in fact, be involved here. Do you worry about this scenario, as I do, that if things are incomplete or go badly, they're unsuccessful as that's perceived, and if there are large number of casualties together with the refugee population, that the explanation for this is not going to be we weren't good enough in fighting counterterrorism, it was tougher than we thought it was, but that this is because of the United States, that the United States is going to get blamed, and that disconnect will connect in that particular way. Because, just if I can just add one more thing, I'm concerned that what this is about is not a real belief that they can destroy, or nor do they want to destroy all the Masouds and so on. As you say, there's the Waziris there who are cooperating and so on. But it's going back to the policy of containment, except, as you rightly point out, this time it's containment negotiating out of strength rather than weakness. And that, in fact, really is the end game. Sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, I mean, I absolutely agree. And to even go even further, I mean, this is counterfactual, can't prove it or disprove it. I suspect very strongly that had Pakistan succeeded in negotiating with Beytullah Masood to reorient his efforts towards Afghanistan, Mr. Masood would not have been killed by a predator having a leg massage. So I think that Beytullah Masood finally found himself deceased was in part because he proved to the Pakistanis that he was absolutely recalcitrant, that he was not going to reorient away from Pakistan and towards the international forces. And I think you're absolutely right that I think there are multiple narratives that you see kind of playing out. One narrative is if the United States would just leave Afghanistan, everything would become copacetic. We can kind of go back to pre-9/11, the mullahs, the military, the Malvis would all be in alignment again with the militants. So I think there is that narrative that if the United States would just leave, everything could sort of go back to its equilibrium position and everything could be managed again. But then I think there are also those who kind of realize that that probably isn't the case, that there has really been a genuine reordering of the region, but not, and I think the public opinion data do show this. I think you can't say the Pakistanis are insouciant about this threat, but they are ambivalent about the best way forward. We have other data that we've collected on political issues, for example, the frontier crimes regulation. So they're not only are they ambivalent about peace deals versus military action, they're also ambivalent about what are some of the constitutional arrangements that might be effective as a palliative. So I think you're absolutely right. The United States will be blamed no matter what, because that's the easy way forward. But I have another concern, and this is something that Seth Jones and I have written that's coming out in Survival. I don't mean to be uncharitable towards the Pakistani so-called coin, but they don't do coin. They do lick. They do low-intensity conflict. And this isn't, this is sort of like you say tomato, we say tomato. No, it's not. Lick and coin are not the same. COIN is a population-focused operational concept that seeks to protect the population. Low-intensity conflict is one that is still very much enemy-focused, and it explains why you have 4 million people being displaced and only a handful of these goons being rounded up. So I don't mean to say that the Pakistanis have not been effective. They're not doing COIN. And I actually do wonder, does it serve, whose interest is served when we keep accolading their COIN successes when these are not COIN successes? For the exact reasons that you mentioned, the government has not been terribly effective at coordinating civil military responses to deal with the humanitarian crises, and we still had leftover problems from the earthquake, right? All the folks who were displaced from the earthquake hadn't been resettled. So I think you're absolutely right. The U.S. is going to be blamed one way or another. We're going to be held at fault for this.
Go with this gentleman here. Yeah.
Bill Veal, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. At the beginning of your talk, you alluded to the assumptions that people made here in Washington were not often right. You also just referred to the information space that Pakistanis have. In a country which has such a high level of literacy, illiteracy, what is your impression of the kinds of sources people use to form the opinions that you're surveying?
Oh, no. Actually, that's a really good question. In fact, it's unfortunate that we don't really have a very good survey of Pakistani information space. For example, it is true that most Pakistanis are, well, we won't say your average Pakistani has about 6 years of education and the literacy that goes with it. But Pakistanis, if you spend time in Pakistan, on the one hand, if you have television, they have a much more rich information space than I think you might expect. There are numerous channels. In fact, the Pakistani television watcher is a news junkie. The only shows that make revenue are the Pakistani news programs, not the entertainment. So the place is it's news junkiistan. They also, for example, the viral video of the woman that was being beaten, a lot of people got information from their cell phones. They use cell phones in ways that, Americans, we're really behind the curve in how we use our cell phones. In radio, the BBC has been doing a lot of monitoring of their BBC Pashto service on both sides of the Durand line. But what I haven't seen, because most of the surveys that get cranked out are these 1,000 urban samples, I haven't seen a terribly good effort, I haven't seen any effort, to be frank with you, that maps out where do people get their information for specific kinds of information. So, for example, just anecdotally from hanging out with people in Pakistan, they might find out information about their locality just from word of mouth. But for domestic news, they might go to PTV. For international news, maybe it's going to be Geo or maybe it's going to be BBC. And it obviously would vary in different places. And there's an enormous amount of linguistic variation. One area where I think the U.S. is completely deficient is that we don't have very good space of the vernacular languages. We tend to monitor the English media pretty heavily because we can. The English media has a pretty tight readership. I mean, the more elite magazines probably have a readership of 3. And obviously, most people are not getting their news from the English media. So there's a big disconnect between where the U.S. has access and leverage versus where people are getting their information. And I think a huge empirical lacuna exists in sort of mapping how people get their information and how we, and quite frankly, I think the Pakistani government, I think also probably could benefit tremendously from understanding how its citizenry gets its information. Because these data show that public opinion definitely matter, and opinion changes. I think it would be terribly helpful to the Pakistani government to have a better understanding of who their citizens are and how they're getting information and how their views are being formed.
Thank you.
From the Council of Wilson Center. Just I want to ask you, what is the agenda of this Islamic militant? What do they want? Do they want to build a Islamic state on Islamic laws? Second, how they feel for the actual president who was imprisoned for corruption and is supported by United States to be empowered, how they look at this president. Is they approving of him or what? Third, I was watching the television last time, and it was an interview with the former president of Finland, Ansari, who got the Nobel Prize, and he was talking about, all the peace in the world, and he mentioned Pakistan, and he said very much related also to the Middle East problem, when they are very much supporting of Palestinian who are really suffering, and all the Islamic religious sites in there. So is it true that they have this connection with the Middle Eastern problem?
That's a big list of questions. So with respect to the Pakistani Taliban, I actually don't care for the term Pakistani Taliban. I think it sort of suggests that there's a coherence organizationally that may or may not be there. These commanders have their local interests. They certainly would like to set up their own parallel state apparatus. In fact, they generally have done so. Some of them would like to set up sort of micro emirates of Sharia. Some of them want to bring down the state. Some of these guys are just criminal operators, just thugs. They're operating under the brand name equity of the Taliban because it's easier to be a criminal if you're a Talib than if you're just a criminal. So I personally just like the term Taliban because it seems to suggest that there's this coherence that probably isn't there, when in fact there's a bunch of different actors calling themselves the Taliban. Their views towards, I take it, Zardari, I don't hang out with them. You're going to have to ask them what they think of Zardari. I suspect that... Well, the public opinion polls are also very clear about that. The IRI routinely asks what they think about these different actors. In April, and I wish I was hoping that we would have our data from our April survey ready to present here, but they're not ready yet. One thing that we did, we asked Pakistan, what I found very interesting is that Pakistan had many constitutions, but no constitutionalism. So according to the 73 Constitution, the Prime Minister should really be the guy running the show. So we asked Pakistanis whether they think the Prime Minister, the President, or the Army Chief should be in control. And what is interesting is there's just not a lot of consensus. So we had sort of asked that question, I don't know what we were expecting. I think we were expecting some kind of consensus. But in fact, what we saw in that question, there isn't any consensus. So if your question's about political legitimacy, there's much more, leaving aside the personal legitimacy of any one individual sitting in office, there's the structural legitimacy about how these different offices interrelate, not only about civil military control, but the debate over parliamentary versus a presidential form of government. And it seems as if Pakistan remains very much conflicted along both of these metrics, civil military as well as presidential versus parliamentary.
Question there? Yes.
Polly Nayak. I'm an independent consultant who does a lot of work on South Asia. Chris, you rightly pointed out that what the Pakistan military has been doing is low-intensity conflict and not coin. And you pointed to one of the most obvious indicators of that, which is the ballooning populace of internally displaced people. What I wondered is whether you're aware of any work that is being done or is being planned to examine the effect of that ballooning IDP, both on the people who are internally displaced, relatively few of whom so far seem to be inclined to go back because of their concerns about security, but also the absence of homes to go back to in many cases. There's been a lot of speculation that IDPs may be particularly fertile ground for recruitment to various radical causes, as such refugees have been elsewhere, but that's pure speculation. I don't think I've seen any solid research on that. And the other half of that picture, of course, is how, given the fact that, for example, people displaced from southern Waziristan probably have relatives in places like Karachi, how that affects those who are near and dear to them, and the general public's opinion. It seems like a huge and increasingly obvious issue.
No, I think you're right. And I don't know of anyone that's doing this comprehensively. When we were there in April, I was somewhat of the belief that this public opinion towards the peace deals would actually re-equilibrate back in their favor, in part because of the reasons that you suggested. When we were in the Punjab and, of course, in Karachi, I don't know how to put this delicately, but there are a lot of ethnic tensions. A lot of people in Pakistan don't like Pashtuns. They view them. I'm a hillbilly, so I can say this. They're viewed as hillbillies among many Pakistanis, sort of unsophisticated. They have social, cultural, religious practices that folks in the Punjab don't terribly embrace, and that's just the reality. That's how folks see it. So people were expressing a lot of concern even then about the Pashtuns that were coming in. They said, well, they're going to bring, this is the kind of vernacular they would use, they're going to bring their culture here. So, I mean, that's how they talk. That's just the reality. So I was sort of anticipating along the lines of you, Polly, that as the IDP crisis became more imbricated nationally, that there'd be some blowback. But I don't think that's happened, though, because most of them are not in camps. Most of them are staying with relatives and friends in homes. And that's where doing even needs assessment becomes difficult if you can't access them. But I think the larger question certainly remains, and I remember when I was a student in Pakistan in the early 90s, when you had a lot of Pashtuns from Afghanistan, and they were very much a part of the economy, and they were also, again, subject to considerable amount of discrimination. The irony is that the Pakistanis were very hospitable, but were not terribly kind to any one given Pashtun from Afghanistan. But very similar set of concerns exist. You know, how long these IDPs remain. You know, what sort of changes that's going to have upon Pakistani social fabric. I think it's just too early to tell, and I don't know anyone that's working on it.
Gentleman, and then we'll go to the woman in the back. Right there, Michael. Hang on, pass him. Yeah.
My name is Hassan Ali Khan. I'm an Indian national, half Indian and half Pakistani. My wife is a Pakistani. And Chris, I was in Pakistan at the same time in April and May. I spent 6 weeks there. And I must say I was very much impressed by the Pakistani generosity in supporting the refugees. Because these refugees were, I think, after the partition, they were greater than what happened during the partition. My question to you is that you have taken a survey of public opinion and the fluctuating support for the army. Sometimes they were supporting the army and sometimes they didn't, especially in the operation in Brunei. Now, did you have any inkling or feeling that if the Pakistani army goes on slaughtering their own people, will there be a dissension in the army, and that will create a greater chaos? Some young army officers might take over, that enough is enough, that you are doing the bidding of U.S. or the internal dissension, whatever it is. And a follow-up question to that is, the groups you are talking about, would they unite if India does any mischief?
Well, the first question, I think, is the more interesting one. When I was, let's see, when was it? It must have been spring of '08, I was there doing some work for USAID, and I actually went out to Quetta, and our pilot had a heart attack. So many of us, we were stranded, in the airport, and that flight that goes from Islamabad to Quetta has a lot of military personnel moving to and from. So I had the opportunity to interact with a number of military officers, and at this point, they were pretty demoralized. Many of them had been. One fellow put it to me very, very bluntly. He said, I didn't join the Pakistan Army to kill Pakistanis. I joined the Pakistan Army to kill Indians. And they were really feeling the toll of engaging in operations against their own nationals at the behest of the United States. And talking to these fellows, and also talking to Pakistanis, you did get the sense that the Army was basically, they were using expressions like the Pakistan Army had become America's poodle. Very, very derogative language. That basically the U.S. would issue a command and the Pakistan Army did it. And so this idea that they were being forced to kill their co-nationals at the behest of the United States in a war that did not sustain, that was not owned by Pakistanis, was a very morale degrading situation to be in. Which is why, and I'm not being very elegant because I got no flaming voice today, which is why what I try to make the argument for in my concluding point is that Pakistani public opinion absolutely matters. If the Pakistani people can be continued to be persuaded this is their war on terrorism, this has a positive feedback upon the Pakistan Army's morale. It's very difficult to sustain those operations, as you saw in '07, when there was such public opposition to them, precisely for the reasons that you had identified. Now, there are all sorts of media accounts about dissension especially among the ranks of the frontier corps. Every once in a while, there'd be some reports of integrity of Army units. But, I mean, that's something that I can't confirm or disconfirm. As for your other point about these groups coalescing, actually, I think what's interesting, we go back to what I believe it was General Pasha said about Baytullah Masood when, in the wake of the Lashkar-e-Taiba attack in Mumbai, when Baytullah offered a ceasefire. I believe, wasn't it General Pasha that said these boys are patriots? Was it General Pasha, Polly? Or was it Kiani or Pasha said that these fellows are patriots after the LET attack when they offered their ceasefire? I forget which one of them said it. Anyways,
I just wanted to follow up that question. We'll get to the other questions, but I just want to nail down this point because you were critical of kind of a low intensity conflict approach, in kind of and implicitly are sort of saying that should be a counterinsurgency approach. Before the Troubles began, there was this basic social contract that these areas west of the Indus had high autonomy, etc., low government penetration as long as they stuck to their side of the Indus, etc. And as Pakistan governments conducted low-intensity conflict west of the Indus, the Pakistan Taliban have retaliated with targeted low-intensity conflict east of the Indus, hitting targets in Islamabad, etc. I'm just wondering, and you talked about attitudes towards peace deals, etc. Isn't it pretty obvious what the peace deal is, which is after this overreach, and the Pakistan reaction, going back to what the social contract was beforehand, that is this east-west divide, and that the Pakistani government would be permissive of the autonomy and the activities kind of west of the Indus as long as it stays to that side of it. I mean, so that I don't know, what would a Pakistan counterinsurgency strategy look like as opposed to low-intensity conflict?
Well, no, I mean, I think there are a couple of issues. I don't think you can go back to the status quo ex ante. I think a number of questions have been engaged that need to be engaged. First of all, why does the federally administered tribal areas have this distinct constitutional status, which Pakistan's own high courts has dismissed? So the High Court of Peshawar has said that FATA is an unconstitutional arrangement whereby the citizens there are not full citizens of Pakistan. They're not fully integrated. One of the interesting problems that this imposes for a counterinsurgency strategy is that there are no police in FATA. Mm-hmm. Right? All you have in FATA are paramilitary forces and these Lashkars and these Qasidars who are not police. So I think one of the questions that has really percolated to the fore is what is the contract that binds Islamabad to the people in the federally administered tribal areas? And you have different opinions on this. There are folks that there are folks who believe Pakistan should integrate them thoroughly as citizens. There are others who say they won't because prior to 9/11, this was a situation that benefited Pakistan tremendously. They basically had this black area from which they could stage militant operations into Afghanistan, into Kashmir with relative impunity because not even Pakistanis could go there and monitor it. So what this has really thrown open is that this is sort of a political structure that might not be sustainable. And in the context of the failure of constitutionalism in Pakistan, the prospects for resolving this are not exactly encouraging. Mm-hmm. So when you sort of look at the long-term trajectory of Pakistan, what you just see is more internal security problems breeding more internal security problems.
Great. Woman in the back. And then we'll come over to this gentleman here on this side. No. Well, the woman to your right there.
Qazi Aslam, I am a student of political science. One of the questions in your survey tried to assess the attitude towards religious extremism. Is it the religious extremism? Is it the attitude towards suicide bombings, or is it, or did you actually try to measure religious extremism in terms of attitude towards blasphemy or rights of women? Because that ideological spectrum has definitely shifted over the last few decades, and especially the last decade in Pakistan. And do you think that these kind of attitudes are actually related to each other? Like one is feeding to the other? Because some of the things Pakistanis have stopped thinking of them as religiously extreme anyway. So do you think that these two attitudes are actually related? Or what is it actually that you're trying to measure?
No, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I didn't present the results from our April data yet because we're still cleaning we're still going through the analysis. I really like your question. There are many words that these firms use that are not terribly well defined or even very meaningful. What we did in our April 07 survey, and I'm happy to share information with you and put you on the email list when we get our results, is that we actually went through a very strict iterative process with our firm that did the translation, back translation. With the enumerators, we also sat down to make sure that they could be easily translated into the vernacular languages of Sindhi, Saraiki, Baluch, Pashto, etc. So this is a very important question. So what we did in our April 07 question, for example, one thing you'll find frequently asked, Pew, Gallup, everyone asks it, PIPA, they love to ask Pakistanis, do you think there should be more Sharia or less? And I have never seen a survey of Pakistanis where more than 3% say there should be less Sharia. I mean, there's just no variation in that question. But what's never asked in that question is, what does Sharia mean? So in our survey, we actually did ask, we tried to unpack, what does Sharia mean? And unfortunately, I don't have the results to share with you right now. The other thing that we've had a lot of difficulty with in using other surveys in trying to is religiosity. So we were trying to explain support for militant groups as a function of religiosity. Now, religiosity seems like a fairly straightforward thing, but then how do you measure religiosity in a survey? Especially in Pakistan, where you have 5 major sectarian traditions, so 4 Sunni, 1 Shia, and then, of course, multiple variations therein. How do you come up, and particularly before our survey, which the results of which I did not present, we don't even know empirically what percentage of Pakistanis are Deobandi, Barelvi, LA Hadith, or what have you. So a priori, trying to come up with a question to measure religiosity when you don't even know the religious constitution of the population you're surveying is very difficult. So we ended up, for example, as a measure of religiosity, asking people whether or not they attend Dars-e-Quran, because Dars-e-Quran would be something that would measure a Quran study circle, largely irrespective of what sectarian tradition they adhered to. But trying to find some measure of religiosity that you could ask in a survey without knowing the distribution beforehand is very difficult. So if you have ideas, we're certainly amenable to hearing those suggestions.
And this gentleman here's been waiting.
Yeah, my question is, my name is Salim. I'm a concerned Pakistani. I used to work with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto as a student in Pakistan. All this you are telling about what is happening now. Who brought us to this situation to Pakistan? Who supported the criminal General Ziaul Haq? Who supported Ayub Khan? Who supported Musharraf? Who's the one who brought us to this situation, destroying Pakistan? You haven't emphasis on that, Why America supported... I
spotted a rhetorical question in there somewhere.
For 32 years, why America supported all military dictators and never helped to establish a single institution in Pakistan? Not even the institution of judiciary. This Chief Justice of Pakistan came here, nobody ever supported him to be reinstated in Pakistan. Only the public, which is anti these mullahs, anti these terrorist organizations, they are helping them. How come America never helped these to establish any institution in Pakistan?
Okay, thank you. And let's just bundle a couple questions, these 3 here, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, hi, my name is Malik. I'm a CPA, and I also write on terrorism. And my question is, the first one is, what is the support base of these extremists? Like I'm a Pakistani, and I think most of the support base you find in the madrasas. And the Pakistan political parties today, they have a great opportunity, just like the lawyers' movement, that they could have a massive, rallies in every citizen of in every city, to actually target these mullahs in the madrasas, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, all these places. They can be targeted if people are willing to come out onto the streets, like it happened with the lawyers' movement. And then the second part is that how about repealing the Hudud ordinance, which actually forms the basis of Taliban ideology, and also asking Saudi Arabia not to support the madrasas, because I have seen, like you have visited Islamabad, you see these mullahs driving around in Land Cruisers. Who is actually paying for all that? So actually, they seem to have a lot of money, and most of it is coming from the Middle East.
Thank you. You could just pass the microphone behind you, and we'll make that our final question, and we'll give Christine a final opportunity to respond. Go ahead.
Albert Cantrell, a independent consultant in public opinion research, perhaps concluding with the question of the day, and that is, what is the prudence and consequence of Secretary Clinton's lecturing the Pakistani people?
I'm going to dodge that one. All right, let me go.
It's a good move.
I had boxing this morning. Just dodge it.
I'll address that.
So your comment, I mean, I've written extensively about the perils of supporting a person, not a policy or an institution. That being said, there has not been a single military dictator in Pakistan that has come to power without the assistance of co-opted political parties. Every single military dictator that's come in, the first thing that he has done has held an election for a parliament of political chumchas that have been all too willing to abandon their political constituencies and principles to obtain a position of power. There has been no judicial action taken against chief justices that bless the takeover by the military dictator. And I can go on and on and on. Military dictators in Pakistan do not come to power through their own force alone. Rather, they have come to power through complete co-optation of the judiciary and the political institutions. I take your point that the United States has heavily subsidized them. But I also, in the spirit of encouraging Pakistani ownership of these problems, would like to point out that these guys didn't come to power. The United States did not put Musharraf in place, did not put Zia al-Haq in place. Yes, the United States subsidized their regimes, but they came to power through co-optation of Pakistani political problems. And that's a problem that Pakistan has to resolve. The problems of Pakistani constitutionalism is a massive problem. However, the blame for that does not reside here in Washington. About the support base for the militant groups, this is actually one of the things that we're trying to get at with our April 07 survey. What I didn't talk about here is if you look at the different surveys that are asked, they're fielded. Very few surveys that are effective, that have low don't know, don't respond rates, go up, knock on the door. Hello, can you tell us what you think of Osama bin Laden? Some of them do. And when you ask about Osama bin Laden, you get really high don't know, don't respond rates because people are probably scared or they don't know who the guy is. So IRI, the work I do with PIPA, we would ask a different question, like, do you think these groups are a threat? Well, asking them if they think a group is a threat is also not the same. You can't assume that if they don't think that they're a threat, that they support them either. So let's say, for example, you live in Gaza. You might think that Hamas, for example, is a problem because the Israelis are bombing you because of Hamas, but you might ultimately support what Hamas tries to do. So the problem with these surveys is that we can't assume that if you don't think they're a threat or that they're a problem, that you somehow support them. So what we tried to do in our April survey is try to do some randomization of experiments to sort of see how does the introduction of the word al-Qaeda or what have you affect an opinion on a policy issue. We're not there yet. We can't brief those results. But what we do know from our 07 survey is that even under the most outrageously framed question, very large minorities of Pakistanis will express support for militant groups. When we asked about the justification of attacks like the parliament attack in Delhi, 1 in 5 thought it was justified. The Taliban regime in Afghanistan enjoyed like 1 in 3 support. So these are minorities, but they're actually fairly large minorities. And since terrorism is a small numbers game, you don't actually have to have 90% supporting a group. One of the more interesting numbers that came from the survey we did in 07 was we actually asked people if anyone from your household has participated in jihad in Kashmir or Afghanistan. Now, just the extraordinariness of this question. Some dude knocks on your door after having talked to you for 15 minutes. The very last question this person is going to ask is, oh, by the way, is anyone from your household participating in jihad in Kashmir? If so, how many? Laugh. But 1% of an urban sample answered that question in the affirmative and even told us how many sons. 1% of an urban sample. So I just put this out there. This is a small numbers game. 1%. I don't know why they. I don't know. But anyways, that's it. I'm not touching that other question. No way.
Great. It's been a very rich discussion, and actually had some really excellent empirical data to in the centerpiece of your analysis, and so we're grateful for that, and also for your willingness to come out on a day when we know you're not feeling well, to keep this meeting date and to address this group. So please join me in thanking Chris Fair for an excellent presentation.